Well, welcome back to the Preaching While Black podcast. My name is Pastor John Richards. I am the host of the Preaching While Black podcast, where we focus on the call, the craft, and the context of the Black preaching tradition. I got a very special guest in this session. It is Reverend Janiece Williams. Many of you all may know her already. If you don't know her, you need to get to know her. She has some amazing resources for the Black church. Looking forward to hearing from her and talking about her call, her craft, and her content of her Black preaching. Let's go ahead and jump right into the episode with Reverend Williams.
Welcome to the Preaching While Black podcast, a podcast dedicated to the calling, craft, and content of the Black preaching tradition. And now, here's your host, John C. Richards Jr.
Reverend Janiece Williams, how you doing?
I'm great.
My people
How are
from
you?
Cleveland, Ohio, representing the Midwest.
Sir.
We were
Yes,
talking
sir.
beforehand, and you said that you're not going to let us claim George Parks over here in Memphis, in the Memphis area.
No,
He is from Cleveland, Ohio.
no, sir. He's a native. He's one of us.
As you are a native, and I've gotten to know your ministry through other folks, and met you at E.K. Bailey. You were there this summer. I said, I got to get her on the podcast because she's doing some amazing work. You're a graduate of Nyack College in New York, BA in Biblical Studies and Theological Studies. Then you got an MDiv at Wake Forest at their School of Divinity, and are currently pursuing a PhD because you just don't have enough degrees and enough schooling. You now have, you're in a PhD program
Glutton for punishment.
at Vanderbilt University. And your program is for preaching homiletics, I'm assuming it is. Okay, great.
Yeah.
And you also have certification for coaching preaching. So let me just say, you love preaching, and you love the art, art and craft of preaching. And I want to dig into some of the resources that you have a little bit later, but I like to start with all the preachers on the podcast, just talking about when they sensed this call that they were called to preaching ministry. So how would you tell the folks who are listening how Reverend Williams got to the place where she felt like she was called to this task of preaching?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always start this story by sharing that, contrary to popular belief, I was not raised in the church. I am the fifth of six children, and you know how they say, like, you've got CME Christians, Christmas, Mother's Day, Easter. We were Christians. We went on Easter, and that was when I was staying the night of my aunt's house. So the bulk of my experience going to church was really, whenever I would stay the night at my aunt's house. So, although, and in light of that, though, my mom would tell you that when I was 3 years old, when all the other kids were outside, running around and playing, I was in the house trying to read the Bible. So it was just in me as a child, even though I really didn't have like images or frameworks that I could remember for what it meant to be a Christian, one, or to be in ministry or go to church at all. Growing up, I would play church. I was still that kid, not having really much experience going to church. I was the kid, I made my siblings sit and listen to me preach to them. Like that was me. I was either going to preach to them or I was going to teach them. So I was literally embodying what I would one day pursue without even knowing that was what was happening. But when I was about 16, I remember watching BET where it was, I think, Jamal Bryant church. He would come on Empowerment Temple. And I'm assuming that it was Jamal Bryant because all I really remember is the way that the knot
it's Jamal Bryant
was tied. And, back then he used to wear like the really like fat
the big
knots in his ties. So that's how I'm making that connection. So I think it was Pastor Jamal Bryant, but so I remember watching church one Sunday, and thinking, man, I really want to go to church. And so I called my aunt, and she scheduled for the church van to come pick me up, and I dragged my little sister to come with me to church. And that's how I started going to church. So for me, my call story really starts with how I even met the Lord and started engaging with
Mm.
church things. Um, After that, I would start going really, really frequently. So I was in church every Sunday. That church van pulled up to my house every Sunday, and I was in place. Because for me, I've always been a shy and introverted person, and I'm still that. But it was a lot deeper even then. And going to church, though, was the place where I really found my place. Like, it was when I started going to church and started to serve. I served in all the ministries. I was in a choir. I was a candy striper. I was on the prayer ministry. I was just anywhere they needed me to serve, I would serve. And this is me at 16 years old, just running around and churching. And then I remember, I actually had this memory the other day that I forgot all about this. There was some service that my church had, and it wasn't like a regular worship service. So I think it might have been a
Mm.
testimony service, but I was like tasked with bringing an encouraging message. It wasn't called preaching, but it was some kind of
Mm.
encouraging message. And so I wrote, I don't even remember what I wrote, but I wrote something, and I stood there that night, and I said it, and like the people just, they were just so
Mm.
enthralled with this 16-year-old girl who, sharing whatever this message was, that at the time I wouldn't have identified as preaching. Um, and not that I didn't think women could preach, I just never really
Wow.
saw them. I didn't grow I wasn't really formed around a lot of
Mm.
women preachers. I think I can remember 2 of them, but they were not but and they loved on me whenever we did see each other, but I never got to see them up close and personal. So I never really had a model for what being a woman in ministry in particular looked like. So I never really knew that that could be something that God was calling me to. Fast forward probably till late 17, almost 18 years old. Yeah, 17 years old. I started I was in a fast. That's what it was. I was in a fast, and, back then, my fasts were, I was fasting from social
Mhm.
media. And during this week, so my commitment was whenever I would desire to get on social media, I would go read my word and pray instead. And so this particular week, there was a preacher coming to town to go preach at my aunt's church. My aunt is a ordained elder, which is interesting that I have female preachers on
Mm.
my mom's side, but I never got to really be around their ministry. I got to be around them, behind the
Mm.
scenes, my auntie, but I never really saw them live in action in church. Well, there was a preacher coming to town for revival, and I was going to the revival at this
Mm.
Pentecostal church, and big time church too, Pentecostal Church of Christ, Bishop Ellis,
Mm.
like that, it was big time church in Cleveland. And that day, the night of revival, I was craving to get on Facebook. So instead, I went and picked up my Bible, and I said, Lord, I'm just going to read wherever the pages fall. And I open up my Bible, and it falls on Isaiah
Wow.
61. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me. The Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings unto me. And something in me like leapt almost. It like something in me felt like God was talking to me. This is the end
Mm.
of my fast, mind you. So I'm like, I close my Bible up, and I'm like, Lord, if this is you talking to me, confirm it tonight in revival. So I go to revival that night, and the preacher goes, I don't know who this is for, but the Lord told me to tell you the answer to your question is yes. Now, in my theologically trained mind now, I'd be like, that's a little vague, you
Right.
know. But let me tell you, God will use anything and
Mhm.
anyone to get
Mm.
his call to you. So I felt when he said it though, something in me like
Yeah.
clarified, like a moment of clarity inside of me. Like I knew God was talking. My body got hot.
Mhm.
Like it was like, oh snap. Like I think God is
Mm.
calling me to preach. Now comes the time for me to talk to my
Mm.
pastor. Well, my Baptist church at 59 years old at the time had never affirmed women in ministry, at least openly. So I didn't even know if my pastor affirmed women in ministry because I had never seen it. We had 10 ministers,
Oh,
associate
man.
ministers, and they were all male. Um,
Mm.
and yeah, so I text my pastor, who's also like my godfather. He adopted me, self-adopted me as his goddaughter, and to this day that I consider my godfather. So I text him like, God, Dad, do you believe in women preachers? And he said, yeah, I believe they can bring forth the word. And I said, okay. So that Sunday, I'm like hyping myself up. I told my little sister, my little cousin, we always went up to his office right before church. And I was hyping myself up. I'm like, man, I need to tell him like officially, like, this is what I'm feeling God is saying. And so after service was over, I go upstairs and I said, God, Dad, I need to tell you something. All dramatic and stuff. And he clears the room out. And I go, I think God is calling me to preach. And he goes, all right, well, let's talk about it. He asked me about my call story, and like literally the rest is history. And so I immediately, I'm blessed to say that I have not at any point experienced, up until maybe a year ago, was the first time I had ever experienced like opposition to me being a preacher because I'm a
Wow.
woman. And I had never experienced that
Mm,
until a year ago.
mm,
And it was that thing. And the thing is my family has always been super supportive. Not they're not unchurched, but they believe in Jesus, is what I'll say. They
mm.
believe in Jesus, but don't
Yeah.
actively go to church. But like I'm like the family
Mhm.
pastor, so
You
they're
praying
all
at all
like,
the family
you
gatherings.
know, oh my sister literally told me yesterday that, you're basically my pastor. And I was like, yeah, like, but the good thing is because I'm the youngest minister in my mom's side of the family. My mom got all the preachers on
Mm.
her side of the family. So I'm the youngest, which means that I don't actually have to be tasked with praying at all the family gatherings. My cousin
That's
Leon
good.
takes care
Okay.
of
Got you.
that.
So let me ask you this, up until
Yeah.
that point,
Mhm.
you weren't so sure if your godfather affirmed women in ministry, like, he giving you no indication by the way he staffed or by the way he approached it, like, you were just, like, trying to figure out if he even thought, and in that moment, when he said that, how did that make you feel as a female who was thinking about entering the ministry?
Relieved, but also though, like, I never really knew how deep the opposition to women in ministry was. So it was more of a relief because I was like, I didn't really know, especially because, like I said, my aunt is an ordained elder in her church. Matter of fact, two of my aunts, and I was there for one of their ordinations. So I didn't really know that there was opposition to women in ministry. I just didn't know that there was affirmation of women in ministry. So I was in like this weird like middle space where it was like I've never seen women opposed, but I've also never at my particular church, because we didn't have, in terms of like staffing, like our church isn't structured in that way, so we don't have like staff pastors, so I never would have known. We have women on staff, but they're like administrative staff, and that's the only kind of
Mm,
staff my church had. So Cleveland's a very traditional city in terms of the Baptist church. So whenever my pastor is an itinerant preacher. So wherever he would travel in the city to preach, we would all go with him. And I'd never seen a woman preacher at any of these churches.
mhm,
And so, especially in the Baptist church, I'd only see them if I was at like a Pentecostal church where my aunt was. But again, like um, I I didn't really get to see my aunts live in action, at least not that I remember. Because again, we didn't go to church all like that. So if I was
mm,
staying the night at my aunt's house on either side of my family, those were really the only times where I went to church. Um, so yeah, I just didn't really have a framework for it, but I did feel a sense of relief. To get back to your question, I
mm,
did feel a sense of relief when he told me that he believed in it, because I was like, oh, first step is, is this a
mm,
thing for me? Is this a thing that's even possible at my church? Because I had never
mm,
seen it. And his in the history, so I was licensed a year later, and myself and the two women I was licensed with, we were the first women in the history of our church to ever be licensed. So we're part of our church's
Come on,
history.
history makers.
Yeah.
I
And I'm
love it.
probably the youngest at the time too, the youngest female for sure, but, I think,
Mm,
I might be the youngest as well. But I don't know, because guys get licensed so much sooner than women
right.
do.
How old were you when you got licensed?
I was 18.
Wow. So
I was
who are the
18.
voices that have continued to shape your call along the
Mhm,
way? Whether it be
mhm.
women voices or other folks who are continuing to help shape or hone that call to ministry as you continue to do what you love to do and preach?
Yeah, so I will definitely say, my home pastor, Cedric Ville, who
Mhm.
is and has always been, my first reference for preaching. Our voices are very different in a lot of ways, but there's some things where I always tell people you could tell that I'm Cedricville's daughter, the way that I start my sermons. Like
Mm.
Pastorville is like 6'4", big guy, but when he starts his sermons off, he's gonna start like on a one, and he's gonna like take off like an airplane, and
Mm.
it's like that is just always has been how I approached entering into a sermon. So you could always hear the influence of my home pastor in that way. And I'm sure that there are many other ways too, but that's the one that's the most like striking. And of course, my current pastor, where I serve and attend here in Nashville, Watson Grove, Pastor John Faison, and he's been on here, and
Yep. Yep.
he has always been a matter of fact, I will say I was it's funny how he even became an influence in my life and in my preaching, because I met him in 2019. I think I probably was introduced to his ministry in 2019 for the first time. And we actually met at Hampton Late Night.
Mm.
And I was, I had followed him. I think I had heard him one time when he came to North Carolina, and I was just so like amazed, like, wow, this guy is really a great preacher. like he's so
Mm.
like structured, and like he tells stories so well, and all these things. And we that night, I can't even tell you who all preached that night, but what I do remember from that night was that I was standing by the door waiting for my friends to come out, and I saw him, and I'm really shy. Like, people don't know this about me, but I'm actually really shy. So I will
Mm.
freeze up before I go and introduce myself to somebody I look up to. And so that was one of those occasions, and he was standing over there by the door, and I was like, oh my God, it's John Faison. Like, oh my God, like I want to introduce myself, but I'm so scared. And he recognizes me from Instagram. He goes like, Jay Renee. And I'm like, like, yes, you're
Mm.
Pastor John Faison. And
Mm.
which is a hilarious story, because we met at Hampton Late Night, and Full Circle last year. We both preached Hampton. He preached the main stage, obviously, and I preached Late Night in
Wow.
the same year. So it was Full Circle last year. It was a beautiful story. But all that is a long way of saying his voice absolutely shapes my preaching. When I'm struggling to figure out how to structure my introductions, I always go and listen to him. Like, in the middle of me writing a sermon, I will go and listen to him and just listen to how he's structuring the way his introductions, because he's just so masterful at it.
Mm.
I'll also say in this last year, you can absolutely hear, two people, Dr. William Curtis
Mm.
and Dr. Danielle Brown, who Dr. Brown I met when I was in undergrad. Like, I met
Who's been on the cast, been on the podcast.
yeah, she's
Yeah.
been on, and
Yeah.
I listened to her episode. It was great. But she and I met when I was a student in undergrad. One of my
Mm.
friends was a minister at International, and there was a service they had going on, and he invited us to come. So we drove all the way from Nyack to Jersey, and that was when we met. And so one of the things I love about her, which I just realized recently, I'm starting to hear her influence in my voice. I love the way she uses her voice when she's preaching. It's
Yep.
almost as if she's sitting on top of her voice, and she is just fully in it, in the fullness of her voice. And I love that so much about her preaching. It like
Mm.
it I want to be able to use my voice the way that she uses hers.
Mm.
Just fully embodied, fully in it. Especially when she's closing. Like that especially, and she's just amazing. So Dr. Brown, and then Dr. Curtis, who is such, like, he's not human. Like,
Yeah. 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 He's not.
he's not he is not human. But I love the way that he sees a text. Actually, I will put Dr. Howard John Wesley in this too. The way that
Mm.
they look at text and are able to identify, like, what you wouldn't see doing what my home pastor would call a casual, if you were a casual Bible reader. He would say, if you're a casual
Mm.
Bible reader, you miss this. There, I am astonished at how they are able to see things in the text that are like you wouldn't be able to see, but like their eye for a text represents all the best of Black preaching. Like, just, I
Mm.
mean, it's masterful. And specifically in terms of Dr. Curtis, his ability to identify tension in the text,
Yeah.
I mean,
Unmatched. Unmatched.
unmatched, just absolutely unmatched.
Yeah.
And then I'll say, lastly, my auntie, and my dad, my auntie and my dad, who are storytellers.
Mm.
I always tell my daddy if he was a Christian, my dad's not a Christian, but if he was a Christian,
Mhm.
he would be a charismatic black preacher because he
Mhm.
has, just as a person, has all of the characteristics of like your n- I- like nationally known black church pastor. Like
Mm.
he is just phenomenal storyteller. My
Mm.
aunt is an author. She writes children's books. And so when we talk, we're always talking about like somehow, some way, one of her children's stories is going to come up, and she's going to be telling me
Mm.
about stories that she's thinking about writing or actively writing. And the way that she just tells a story just draws you in. And in the last year, that's something I've been working on. And I think of
Yeah.
her often when I think about what it means to tell a story, a compelling story, how to structure
Mm.
a story. So those are really the voices in this
Mm.
moment. Yeah.
That's really important, especially for younger black preachers who are listening, like the importance of storytelling.
Mm,
I was telling someone on a previous episode about how storytelling recaptures the attention and imagination of people. Like,
yeah.
even if you were in the middle of kind of exposing a text, doing some expository identity of the text, there's some people that get lost.
Yeah.
But once you get a story and tell a
Mm,
story, then they lock back in. And I
yeah.
think people like your dad and your aunt who are storytellers understand the
Mm,
importance of story. I'm like,
yeah.
man, if we got the greatest story ever told, just tell the
Yeah.
story.
Legit. It works every time.
Yes, every
It
time.
never fails.
Every time. So we've explored your call.
Yeah.
When we come back after the break, we're going to talk about the craft of your preaching.
Yeah.
You seem like someone who loves preaching, but also loves the preparation process of preaching. And we're going to
Yeah.
talk about that after the break.
Awesome.
Scholars have referred to the original black church as the invisible institution because enslaved people were often not allowed to worship freely. They'd have to gather, sing, and preach in secret to avoid being beaten. Yet they still developed a deep devotion to the authority of Scripture and the liberation narrative. Today, many Christians who don't fully agree with conservatives or progressives feel invisible. They're not well represented in politics or mainstream media. In response, the AND campaign has created the Invisible Institution newsletter, or IVI. We'll be providing political commentary, policy breakdowns, and more for Christians who believe in social justice and moral order, not one or the other. Go to andcampaign.org and subscribe if you're sick and tired of feeling invisible.
All right, so let's talk about the craft of preaching. And I'm
Mhm.
over here rubbing my hands together like Birdman because you got a resource for the church that deals with the craft of preaching. It is the Sermon Development Workbook. Folks can check it out on your website. What's your website again?
JanieceRenee.com.
JanieceRenee.com. She has a resource for you all called the Sermon Development Workbook. And part of that workbook, there's a couple of different elements I want to highlight because I did pick up a copy of E.K. Bailey. Number one, you have this idea to outline section where you're trying to move people from idea to outline as part of their process to what you say demystify the sermon development process.
Mhm.
How did that come to be in your own life, in your own preaching, and how do you think it helps people to be able to do so in their own preaching?
Yeah. So I will say one of the things that was the most helpful for me was actually starting this PhD program. Where I've gotten to, I mean, I had a process up until that point, of course, been preaching for 12 years now, and I've been in my PhD program. This is my fifth year. But starting my PhD and actually getting to read different theories of preaching exposed me to just a lot of different approaches, and helped me to identify for me what made for a well structured, easy to follow sermon. So for me, the way that my brain works in terms of how I listen to a sermon, I need some kind of roadmap. Now, this is why I love me a good Black Baptist 3 point,
That's right.
sermon. Like
That's right.
I know it's people are like, yeah, you don't have to do 3 points. So you don't. I'm not one of those people. You don't have to do 3 points. It works for me though, because I like to be able to follow you. I like structure. I like, I was describing it to someone the other day when we read in Ezekiel 37, the valley of the dry bones, the first thing that God the Spirit calls back into formation are the bones, the structure of the body. Before there's ever any flesh put on it, before there's ever any muscles put on it, those bones had to be in place first in order to give a shape to whatever that body was supposed to look like. And I think the same is true of our sermons, that you need some kind of structuring system in place to give a format, sense of form to whatever that sermon's going to be. And
That's
the
good.
same is true of the actual sermon, right? So that your I think of it like, usually use the image of like a roadmap, right? Like,
Mm.
and if you're going to put a destination in the GPS, before you can know what streets you need to turn down, you actually need to know where you're
Where
going.
you're going.
And
Yeah.
so, a lot of different ways to get there, but you need a destination before you can,
Mm.
actually start figuring out what streets to turn down. So I usually, when I'm teaching preaching, because this is just how I think about it, is that like I can't construct a sermon until I have determined where the sermon is going.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
when I'm coaching, like I literally, when people call me and ask me what I think about their sermon, first question I'm always going to ask is, what's your thesis?
That's
I
it.
can't help you think through a sermon and how to get there if I don't know what there is, right?
Mm.
And so, I don't even know if this is answering your question, but
This
like,
is. This is.
okay, because I could talk about these things all day, like, and a strong thesis. I mean, like, what does the sermon attempt to say, right? Like, what in one sentence does the sermon is this sermon saying? And the reason
Yeah.
why that's so important, besides the fact that you need to know where you're going in order to figure out how to get there, is that our listeners, right? Like, they're not gonna remember all the fancy things that you said. They're not gonna remember all the fancy things that you did to say what you were saying,
Nope.
but they might be able to articulate something close to what it is you wanted this sermon to say at the end of the
Mm.
day.
Mm.
And for me, that's why that thesis is so important. That's why that ultimate destination is so important, because it is giving your listeners, if they don't take away anything else from this sermon, this main idea, or so to speak, is somewhere
That's it,
around,
man.
you know,
That's it. Yeah.
yeah,
So that's Brian Chappell talks about passing that 3 a.m. test in
yeah,
Christ-centered preaching. Like
yeah,
if somebody wakes up at 3 a.m. and you wake them up and you say, "Hey, what's the sermon about?"
yeah,
At least get the thesis out there, the
yeah,
elevator pitch. Hey, this is
yeah,
what this message is about. Some people call it sermon in the sentence. Some people call it the sense
right,
of truth. Whatever it may be, thesis, whatever it may be. At least have that.
right.
Let folks know where you're taking them.
That part.
Yeah. I love Andy Stanley's Communicating for Change. That was one of the first books I read, because I always looked at Stanley and was like, bro, how are you taking people on a journey without knowing that they're going on a journey?
Yeah,
And he's like, man, I just know where I'm going
yeah.
and I take them along the way. And that's the important part about this process. So you go from idea to outline. Are you an outline preacher or a manuscript preacher?
I am a bona fide certified manuscript preacher. Oh God.
You said bona fide and certified.
Bona
Like
fide and
both
certified.
ends.
Both ends. Ooh, I wish
Okay.
I had the memory to be able to do it without it. I don't wish that, actually.
Mm,
I'm not even gonna say that. I like
mm.
working with a manuscript, right? Like,
You do.
yeah, like semantics are really important to me. Like,
Mm.
if I
You like
spend
getting your words right.
just right. So I'm a poet, right? So, and
Mm.
I've always been a spoken word artist. So the way that you say something, my mama would always say, it's not what you say, it's how you
That's
say
how
it.
you say it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's so important to me to be able to say a thing the way that I want to communicate it. Now, of course, we know that once it comes out, the people are going to hear what they're going to hear. Right. They're going
Mhm.
to interpret it the way they're going to interpret it. And that's a work that happens between them and the Holy Spirit. But I want to do my very best to communicate my idea the way that I'm hoping to communicate it. Because one sentence said in a particular way might mean two different things depending on
Yeah.
who you're talking to. So I am a manuscript preacher in part, in part because my memory ain't that great, but uh, but also in part because I want to say something very specific. And so
Mm,
I need to think through it. I actually probably spend the most time thinking through how I'm going to say a thing. It
mm,
probably takes me forever to, that's why I can't get past my thesis. That's why I can't write without
mm.
my thesis. I need to know where I'm going because that becomes then the filter for everything else that I'm going to say and do.
That you're gonna say. That's
Yeah.
good. So in your sermon development workbook, you have something that I wish more preachers did,
Mhm.
and this is the self-evaluation worksheet.
Yeah.
And so here's the thing I've learned with preachers, and I talk to younger preachers out of church all the time about this. They hate watching themselves and
Yeah.
evaluating themselves after they preach.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you have to absolutely do it. And so
Yeah.
you have a process where you walk folks through the process of doing the hard work because it's tough. It's
Yeah.
tough watching yourself.
Yeah.
Because people come up to you afterwards and say that's great. And then you're like, man, I missed like 2 or 3 things.
Yeah.
We're our
Yep.
biggest critics, right? So what made you include that in your workbook for preachers as they are looking to hone their voice and their gift?
Yeah. So because I think other people should not be the first voices that we hear when assessing our work. Um, Other folk gonna talk about it, but our voices should also be a part of our reflection process. Um, I don't know how many preachers. Well, I can't say that. Most of us don't like to hear ourselves preach, right? Like it's just it's weird, right? Like
Yeah,
I
yeah.
literally heard myself preach the other day, and I stopped and said, wow, does my voice sound like that to everybody? Like, it's
Right.
just
To
me.
the whole.
Like, what? Like, what are you doing? But I think it's critical because, like, how else do you grow, right? Like, you know what you were hoping to do in the construction of this sermon, and then the preaching moment happened, the preaching event happens, and Holy Spirit is involved in that, and your conversation partners, i.e. your listeners, are involved in that. And so what you were intending to do in the writing process and what actually happens in the preaching event may not always be the same thing, right? And
Mhm,
so
mhm,
you have to be able to go back and assess both what you were hoping to do and what actually happened in that preaching event, and to be able to say, okay, here are some things that I did well, because that's important too. You need to be able to identify, okay, this is my Josh Mitchell will call it superpower. This is my superpower.
mm,
But
mm.
then also here's some areas where I could grow. Or maybe you killed it, right? Maybe you went and it was the greatest
Right.
sermon of all time, right? Maybe there are some things though that you want to get better at, right?
Mhm,
Like for me, I'm working on becoming a better storyteller. So
mm,
in this last year, there are probably more stories in my sermons than ever before in the last 12 years because I'm actively working on that. I'm not the greatest storyteller, but how else
mm,
do I become a better storyteller if I don't go back and listen to how I've done it in the past and begin to reevaluate how I could get better at doing that? So that self-reflection piece is helpful for giving you time to listen to what's actually happening in your sermon, in both your sermon, the manuscript, but then also in the live preaching event if you have access to that video, and being able to say, like, here are some areas of some opportunities for me to actually grow. I think that we are called to be good stewards of the call,
mm,
and a self-assessment is merely an attempt to be a good steward of the call to preach.
mm. That's so good. And I think one of the things that we tend to do when preaching is try to lean into our strengths
Mhm.
and ignore the weaknesses.
Yeah.
Like, so folks will be like, oh, I can do this really well. And I'm going
Mhm.
to do this really well. And I don't really like doing this. I hate illustrations. So I'm just not going
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
But one of the things that God is calling us to do is to steward every moment in the preaching moment well. And so I
Yeah.
think that evaluation tools like this help us to be able to do that.
Yeah.
We're talking about the craft, so I got to ask you about resources. And I'm a
Mhm.
book nerd, and I'm nosy, so I see I got new interpreters behind you, over your shoulder. That looks like a whole set of new interpreters back there. And so, my question is, what kind of resources are your go-to resources as you are preparing your sermons?
obviously. um,
Right.
but there's a study Bible that I have, and I'm looking to see if it's around me. It might be somewhere in the living room, but there's a study Bible that I have that's called the Complete Jewish Bible
Mm.
translation.
Hmm.
And the reason why I love that is because it tries to amplify the Jewishness of scripture so that we can see like the things that we wouldn't readily see that are cultural references, the things that we wouldn't readily see in a regular English translation. And it's got a whole lot of like articles and footnotes in it. It's literally like my favorite translation. So like,
Mm.
and I've
Hmm.
started preaching from it, but I don't want people to be like, she's preaching from a Jewish
Right.
Bible,
Which one
you
is that one? We not Jewish.
right, like, so so yeah, but that one is such a great resource. The articles
Mm.
and the footnotes in that one is just, oh, I remember one time I was doing the prayer call for our church, and we were following a 31-day guide, and so there were
Mm.
predetermined scriptures. Well, I was filling in for my pastor, and so the days that he gave me were like days we were reading like Deuteronomy and like Leviticus, and I was like, what kind of devotional am I gonna do from Deuteronomy and Leviticus? Like, that's
Right.
crazy. I went and read it in this translation and looked at the footnotes.
Mm.
When I say the footnotes shouted me
Mm.
in like Deuteronomy. I'm like, what is this?
Mhm.
But it's
Right.
because it's amplifying the culture in a way that we
We
wouldn't
might not
readily have
see
access to.
otherwise.
Yeah, and I was
Yeah.
like, wow, this is some good stuff. So that is like one of my
Mm.
favorite resources.
It's so
Um,
good.
yeah.
Mm.
Also the New Cambridge, I think it's a New Cambridge commentary set. So it's a multi-volume. So obviously each volume is written by a different writer, but that one I have found, and all the different texts that I have that one in are really, really good, really, really helpful, scholarly
Mm.
commentary set.
Mm.
Also, so I still have access to my Vanderbilt database. So this is what is
That's
keeping me
clutch.
from. Yeah, it is. It literally is. So this is what's keeping me from getting logos right now, because I'm like, I still
Mm.
have access to Vandy, and so
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
have access to Atlas and JSTOR and like
Yep.
all the things where I can get these articles that aren't just out there in the streets, and so that's been
Mhm.
super helpful too, to be able to go and get these scholarly articles by scholars. And then I'll say I have conversation partners. I remember I have this sermon I preached about Job's wife,
Mm.
and I was struggling with some language things, and I called a Hebrew Bible scholar because and the only reason I recognize everybody didn't have access
Everybody don't
to.
have that. Everybody don't have that. You said,
I named what I have
I just
privilege.
called up a Hebrew Bible scholar, you know what I'm saying?
And I told her too after that conversation. I was like, "Yeah, we're gonna do this more often." Like, but she's a
Mm.
classmate, right? So for those folks who might be in school, there
Seminary.
might be PhD
Yep.
students around you who are studying Hebrew Bible, or studying Hebrew, studying Greek. If you got some friends who are Hebrew Bible scholars or New Testament scholars, call these people and talk to them. Like, you got fresh access from
Mhm.
emerging scholars. So that's a fun, thing that I have that I recognize everybody doesn't have. So
Mm.
there's that. Who else? Uh, uh, I can't call her name. Judy Finches Williams
Mm.
has Holy Imagination, which looks at it's a look at the literary from the literary perspective. All the books in the Bible kind of tell you from the point of view of what's happening literarily in each of the texts. So it's looking at them in terms of like
Mhm.
genre, and like it is a phenomenal book. Black female scholar, Black woman scholar.
Love that.
Uh,
Mm.
so,
Mm.
gotta support, and I mean, phenomenal resource, just absolutely, knock it out the park. Anything by, J.L. Levine,
Mm.
Amy Jill Levine, rather, and she is a Jewish New Testament scholar.
Mm.
So she's not a Christian, so for the saints that, are following that, gotta name that,
Hey,
gotta be
we
honest about
we
that.
we need our Jewish brothers and sisters to understand some of that stuff
Yes,
for sure. So that's so
very much.
good. So
Yeah,
those are a lot of resources that a lot of folks have not heard on the podcast before. So I
mhm,
appreciate that as you talk about the craft of preaching. We're going to
yeah.
move into the content and the context of your preaching here in the
Yeah.
next segment. Looking forward to it. I'll see y'all after the break. What's up, Preaching While Black fam? Listen, I hope this interview has been a blessing so far. If you want more content and resources around Preaching While Black, go over to our YouTube channel, Preaching While Black. We have all the episodes from our interviews up, but we also have other resources for you as a Black preacher as you try to hone your craft, your call, and your content for Black preaching. Now back to our episode. All right, so let's talk about the context of your preaching and the content of your preaching. You're someone who is uniquely positioned with one foot in the academy and one foot in the local church. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes people don't have those bridge people available in order to help to bridge that context. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you get some academy folks that come into church and you're like, is this a lecture or is it a sermon? And then sometimes you get some of the church folk who are in the academy. It's like, hey, you don't have any types of resources or sources that you're using for this lecture. So what's happening right now?
Yeah.
So for you as someone who is in both spaces, how do you personally try to bridge that gap when you're teaching in the classroom and then when you're preaching in the pulpit?
Yeah, so I often talk about how I hope to bridge the gap between church and academy. That looks very, very different in church and in academy, and there is a way that I do it in between, and I'll talk about that in a second. In terms of like academic space, I really just like to use real life examples of like what this stuff looks like on the ground, because I mean there's one thing to like just theorize about it. The good thing about practical theology, especially when we talk about preaching, is that it is a practical field, so it's not as up in the ether somewhere as like if you were sitting in maybe a philosophy ancient class, right? Like
no shade.
Yeah, no shade. That's my minor is in ethics and society. So, it is a lot easier to make that bridge in terms of being able to give folks practical examples of what this looks like on the ground. Also, because where we do fall short in the academy about missing the boots on the ground experience, I remind folks of Mother Grady. That's one of my favorite tropes. Mother Grady and Sister Jamie. Mother Grady is that church mother who was born on the pew, 90 years old. She still read King James Version of the Bible because that is the Bible.
Is the Bible.
Right? Like, and she represents and embodies all the things that the academy has taught us to deconstruct, right? And we have to remember, when I introduce her into a space in conversation, my attempt is, or my aim is to remind us that she still exists, right? And she has 90 years of formation, 90 years of being socialized in this very particular way theologically. And so we have to, when we talk about deconstructing people's theology, we have to remember several things. One, that for those of us who went to seminary, we had 3 concentrated years to do that in community in a guided way with other people who are also losing their minds, being deconstructed, right? Like you had conversation partners who you could fall apart with, right? And then be reconstructed with, right? Mother Grady is our reminder that church contexts don't function like that. Right?
Yeah, you're right.
We're talking, we have to remember that you can't just, it is spiritual malpractice to walk into somebody's house and pull the chair from up under a 90-year-old woman. Like it just, if we think about what that literally looks like, we're doing the same thing when we go into our churches, or when we take everything that we've learned in the academic space and go into our churches and try to do the same thing to them that happened to us. First of all, you have a call on your life to do this. You have a call on your life to engage in this journey, and not to say that, the folks that we minister to are not likewise called in some capacity to wrestle with the difficulties of our faith, but to say that you have a particular mandate on your life and have been privileged to go through a particular kind of process to engage that journey. Whereas the folks in our church don't always have access to that kind of experience. And so introducing Mother Grady into the classroom is how I try to mitigate that going into the church and pulling a chair up under folks kind of an experience. In the church realm, though, I think that so I have a really interesting kind of perspective on this because I am not a pastor, and
Mhm.
so not to say that there's a want for or a lack of academic engagement in my preaching, but to say I'm very careful about how I do that in my preaching because I recognize that there is, in a sense, a way in which I have an ethical responsibility to attend to the people for the limited amount of time that I have to attend to
Right.
those people. And so it looks a lot different in the church. And it is, I would say, that the use of story is really good for helping to bridge those gaps. Practical examples is really good for helping to bridge those gaps to make it plain, as the preacher would say.
Mm.
Um, Now there's also where my heart is in terms of what it means to bridge that gap between church and academy. My heart is in coaching. And the
Mm.
reason why is it helps me to, over a sustained period of time, personally journey with people in a way that academy doesn't have time to do,
Mm.
and in a way that the church may not have a resource to do.
That's good.
And so just being able to journey alongside people in a coaching setting allows me to be able to bridge that gap and to create opportunities um, outside or in between the church and the academy for folks to continue to learn is really kind of how I bridge that gap, and where I can also employ both resources on either side that I just talked about
Mm.
in a way that's more free and not accountable to a larger institution,
Yeah, right.
or not accountable, yeah.
One of the things that I recognize also, Janice, in the church context, having been in the academy and then coming into the church context, is that can also play itself out in Christian education as well, right?
Yeah.
So at our church, we have a school of ministry that where we teach certain classes. I've
Mhm.
taught the How to Study the Bible class, which is a scaled down version of exegetical methods
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is created for lay people and
Yeah.
helps them to kind of understand some of the nuances of how to study a text. And
Yeah.
so, even though it doesn't happen on the pulpit on Sunday, because there's no
Mhm.
way I'm taking everything that I learned in the study into the pulpit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
like you said, that would be just malpractice.
Yeah.
But there are people who also want to get a deeper understanding. And we found in the Christian education space, where it's traditionally been Sunday school in some spaces, people are wanting to get some of that heavier, meatier,
Yeah.
possibly academic type teaching as well.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
I love Christian ed, like, that is that I'm a teacher, so that's
Right.
like,
You're like, I love
that's
that space. Yeah, yeah,
my
yeah.
jam.
So let's talk a little bit about context as we get ready to close here. You're currently in Nashville.
Mhm,
um, in terms of your location. You got an MDiv from Wake Forest, so you're in North Carolina. You're
yeah,
in the Bible Belt South,
yeah,
and you know what the cultural temperature is these days around election season. Just
yeah,
there's been so much polarization in our culture, in our context. And as a Black female preacher in these spaces, as a Black female academic in these spaces, what are some of the hopes and challenges that you see in that context around being a preacher, someone who proclaims the good news, but the world
mhm.
around us just seems to be like so much bad news?
Ooh, well, when I think about the history of preaching largely, and then especially the history of Black preaching, preaching has always had to respond to the context, the social and cultural context that it took place, that it was speaking to. It had to, right? And so while it can feel like, oh, it's just so bad, like what hope is there? Preaching has always had to preach into a context of hopelessness. The reason the gospel is, right? Like the right? Like the the
Yeah.
the 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 women, the first women preachers. We're preaching a resurrected Christ who was crucified by a Roman government. Like, what does
That's
that
right.
say about their social context, right? So, like, that has always been what preaching was, created to do, or meant to do. And then when we think about Black preaching in particular, Black preaching was forged in the context of death and oppression and like evil, right? Like it was this way of embodying resurrection hope, right? That there is a word that transcends, that hopes to transcend the context that we're living in, to speak a word of hope into a deadly and oppressive world.
Mhm.
That's what Black preaching has always had to do. It has always had to, the way that I conceive of Black preaching in particular, has always had to intend to help people to live,
Mhm.
right? If you were to ask me what Black preaching is, there are a lot of different ways that folks have attempted to answer that question. But the way that I answer that question is to say that Black preaching is defined by what it intends to do. If the preaching that a Black person does intends to make use of our culture in order to help people to live, then it is Black preaching, because that is what we have always been trying to help people live just a little while longer, to live with hope. And I like something that Dr. James Cone once said to Dr. Emily Towns. She tells this story, and I'm not going to attempt to imitate Dr. Cone's voice because I just skill set.
Right.
But she says she was finishing her book, Breaking the Fine Rain of Death, which talks about Black health. And she says she was finished. I think she was trying to finish the last chapter, and she picks him up for some lecture that he was doing here. And he asked her how the book was going. And she said, I'm really struggling to finish this book, because after looking at all the data, I can't figure out where the hope is. Like, I just can't figure it out. And he said to her, Emily, you have to have hope. You must have hope, because without it, then they've won. And I just believe that Black preaching attempts to, or is that way of resisting hopelessness being the conqueror, right? Like it is the way that we resist hopelessness winning, that we resist evil winning, despair winning. No, we preach hope, because resurrection is evidence, right? That there is something that transcends the evil that this world is and produces. And so, yeah, I think that for me, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that for me is it. That is how I feel about like what it means to preach, generally speaking, but to preach in a hopeless world.
That's so good. Ladies and gentlemen, the Reverend, on her way to be Dr. Janiece Williams. She rocked it on this episode. Thank you for joining me, Reverend Williams. Such a rich episode. Got so many resources. We're going to put them in our description on the podcast. Y'all going to be reading that Jewish Bible soon enough. She might not convert some of y'all from the CSB or the ESV, but that'd be a good resource for you all.
I still read my NRSV though, if anybody that wants. I got my red book right here.
She said, "I'm not all the way Jewish, okay?" Not all the way Jewish. But thank you again for joining us on the podcast. We'll put links to your resources as well. Thank you for resourcing the church, and we're looking forward to future resources from you as we all try to figure out this thing called Black preaching. But again, this episode gave us hope, because we are people who've always had to do it, preach hope in hopelessness. So thank you again, Reverend Williams. All right, y'all. We'll see y'all next go round for the Preaching While Black podcast. Grace and peace.
Thanks for listening to the Preaching While Black podcast. For more helpful content and resources, connect with us online at preachingwhileblack.com.